In the late autumn of 1829, the town of Weatherford, Massachusetts stood in a silence it had never known before. The leaves had already dropped, the fields lay barren, and the air carried a brittle chill. But it was not the season that gripped the people with unease. On a dim November morning, townsfolk gathered on the edge of the churchyard to witness a funeral unlike any other in memory. 11 coffins lined in a row, each nailed shut, each heavy as stone, and yet none containing a body. They had been fashioned hastily by local carpenters, painted black with pitch, and lowered into freshly dug graves while the townspeople watched in dread. The Everett family, once pillars of local society, had vanished without a trace just weeks before. No search, no testimony, no evidence could explain their sudden absence. What remained were these coffins, demanded by the town's elders as a gesture of closure, though closure was a lie. Mothers clutched their children closer as the procession dragged on. Fathers kept their hats in hand, unsure whether to pray, curse, or remain silent. Even the priest faltered, his voice cracking as he tried to speak rites over wood boxes that carried nothing but stones and clothing. Whispers curled through the crowd like smoke. Some muttered of debts unpaid and enemies created, others of God's punishment for Jonathan Everett's arrogance. A few dared suggest the family had made a pact with the devil himself. Yet the louder truth was something no one wished to say aloud, that evil had entered Weatherford not from the outside, but from within its most respected household, and that the coffins were only symbols to hide what everyone feared. The Everetts had not died ordinary deaths. As the shovels scraped dirt over the lids, children said they heard tapping from beneath. One girl claimed she saw a lid shift, though the men nearby insisted it was only settling earth. Still the image lingered. 11 coffins in a row, silent in the cold soil, each one heavier than it should be, each one lowering into the ground without the comfort of flesh to anchor the grief. It was as if the town had buried its guilt rather than its dead. When the final mound was smoothed and the crowd dispersed, an eerie stillness clung to the cemetery. Families returned to their homes without speaking, as if a veil had fallen over Weatherford. Shopkeepers closed their shutters early, lamps were left burning through the night, and children were hushed if they dared to ask questions. The burial was supposed to be an ending, but it became the beginning of an unspoken curse. For in that moment, the story of the Everett family became less about their absence and more about the shadow they left behind. 11 coffins with no bodies marked the ground, but what was buried that day was not flesh. It was truth. And the truth has a way of rising even when nailed under wood and stone. The town had dressed itself in mourning, but mourning for what no one could say. The graves stood not as memorials, but as warnings. Weatherford had chosen silence, and silence would be the soil in which its darkest secret grew. Jonathan Everett was remembered by the town in 2 very different ways. To some, he was a man of learning and discipline, a physician whose sharp mind earned him respect in Boston before he returned to Weatherford to raise his family. To others, he was a presence that unsettled even in kindness, a man whose gaze lingered too long, whose hands seemed to measure rather than comfort, as though every human being before him was not a neighbor but a specimen. His arrival had been celebrated. His departure or disappearance would be whispered about for generations. Jonathan's public life was wrapped in dignity. He dressed with precision, spoke with a measured calm, and quoted scripture as easily as he referenced the latest European medical journals. Town records describe him as stern but charitable. He donated to the church, offered medicine freely to the poor, and read to children during Sunday gatherings. Yet for all his gestures, a distance clung to him. It was as if every kindness were a calculated act, a piece of an experiment rather than a true offering of heart. His private papers, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment of the Everett estate, revealed another Jonathan altogether. In neat, unwavering handwriting, he wrote not of cures but of conquest over mortality. He believed that the body was only a vessel, a shell that could be emptied, altered, or filled with new essence. He made lists of measurements, how long it took a pulse to falter under different conditions, how long an eye could hold its brightness after breath ceased, how many words a dying man could speak once the lungs began to collapse. To him, life was not sacred. It was a formula waiting to be broken apart. Neighbors had long overlooked the warning signs. They remembered the animals delivered late at night, the chemical smells drifting from his property, the cries that were dismissed as nightmares or storms. When questioned, Jonathan always had an answer. He was testing new tinctures, repairing instruments, training his children in discipline. His composure deflected suspicion. In truth, his house had become less a home and more a theater of control, where he tested not only medicines but obedience itself. Jonathan believed silence was the truest measure of power. He practiced methods of restraint that left no visible wounds, fasting, sleeplessness, and hours of forced stillness. His children were required to remain in their chairs without speaking, sometimes from sunrise to sunset, while Jonathan observed them as though charting the progress of an illness. When they faltered, he noted it in his journals. Their suffering was not misbehavior to him, it was data. What unsettled the town most in hindsight was not what Jonathan did, but how seamlessly he concealed it. He shook hands firmly, nodded respectfully, and spoke with authority. He was the kind of man who made others feel lesser, though they could not explain why. Behind that facade, he harbored obsessions that blurred faith, science, and cruelty into one. Jonathan Everett was not the kind of man who erupted with anger or struck with open violence. His was a quieter evil, methodical, ritualized, and patient, and it was this patience, this cold persistence, that would one day leave Weatherford standing at 11 empty graves, burying not bodies but the truth he had stolen. The Everett estate stood at the edge of Weatherford, a sprawling structure of dark wood and brick that loomed over the surrounding fields like a sentinel. From a distance it seemed a symbol of prosperity. Broad windows facing the town, smoke rising neatly from its chimneys, and a garden once tended with care. But up close, the house revealed itself as something else entirely. Its shutters were often sealed, its gates locked, and its paths strangely empty of laughter. The children were rarely seen outside, and when they were, they walked in rigid silence, eyes lowered as if fearful of looking too long at the world beyond the walls. Those who worked inside the house spoke of an atmosphere that could not be explained. The servants, few in number, lasted only weeks before resigning with trembling excuses. They described the air as thick with an unnatural sweetness, the scent of burnt sugar masking something rotten. At night they heard noises that did not belong to an ordinary home. The grinding of metal, the soft weeping of unseen voices, the muffled thud of something being dragged across stone. When they asked questions, Jonathan Everett answered only with a polite smile, his words clipped, his eyes cold. The deeper one went into the house, the stranger it became. Some rooms were stripped bare, their furniture nailed into the floor as though to prevent escape. Others were locked tight, their keys carried only by Jonathan. The cellar was the most feared place of all. Even in daylight, it seemed colder than the earth around it, its walls lined with iron hooks and heavy doors reinforced with bolts. Rumors spread that Jonathan kept the cellar soundproofed, and though no one dared prove it, those who lived nearby swore they sometimes felt vibrations beneath the ground, as if the very soil carried the echoes of what was hidden below. Windows that once opened to fresh air were now barred or covered with cloth soaked in resin, shutting out both light and sound. The children's rooms were arranged in unsettling symmetry, each bed spaced the same distance apart, each toy placed with unnatural precision. It was less a place of rest and more a series of cages dressed in domestic disguise. On the mantel of the parlor, Jonathan displayed preserved insects pinned under glass, beetles, moths, dragonflies, arranged in patterns that mimicked the seating order of his own children at the dinner table. The house became his laboratory of control. Jonathan tested not only bodies but the very idea of obedience. He was fascinated by thresholds, how long a human could endure silence, confinement, or fear before breaking. The methods he employed left no scars, yet the spirit of the house carried wounds deeper than flesh. His cruelty was precise, calculated, and always concealed behind doors that no one in town dared open. What the townspeople saw was only the surface, a family retreating from society, a house that kept to itself. But behind those locked doors, the Everetts were not living as a family. They were subjects in a continuous experiment, their lives reduced to data points in Jonathan's ledger. The children learned to suppress cries, to swallow fear, to move only when permitted. Mary Everett, once the bright presence of the household, had grown quiet. Her footsteps measured, her smile faded. The Everett estate, with its silence and its locked rooms, had become less a home and more a monument to secrecy. From the outside, it was orderly, respectable, almost enviable. But within every corner, every sound, every shadow testified to a truth no one in Weatherford wished to face. The evil that would hollow out this family did not come from outside intruders' curses or chance. It grew behind closed doors in plain sight, nurtured by a man the town had trusted. Jonathan Everett's cruelty was not thunderous, nor was it the kind that erupted suddenly in violence. It was a cruelty of quiet calculation, sharpened not by rage but by patience. He understood that true control did not come from force alone. It came from silence, from molding the mind until it yielded without resistance. The punishments he devised left no broken bones, no bruises for neighbors to notice, only children whose eyes dimmed and whose voices grew weaker over time. He demanded silence as if it were a sacred law. In the Everett household, to speak without permission was to invite punishment. A child who whispered too loudly or asked a question at the wrong moment might find themselves confined to a chair, forced to sit motionless from dawn until nightfall, while Jonathan recorded the tremors of their small hands, the flutter of eyelids trying not to close. He measured the exact hour when stillness gave way to collapse, and he called it progress. At night, he employed methods that blurred ritual with science. Hollow pipes ran from one end of the cellar to another, allowing his voice to travel unseen through the walls. In darkness, the children heard scripture whispered into their ears, verses repeated endlessly until their meaning dissolved and only the sound remained. Jonathan noted how long it took before a child began to sob, how long until they stopped responding altogether. To him, this was not cruelty. It was research on the boundaries of the mind. Some punishments were designed to capture what he called the moment of surrender. He sealed his children's mouths with resin, claiming to preserve their last breath, then watched as panic overtook them until exhaustion forced obedience. Other times he drained blood in careful increments, leaving the victim awake and trembling, timing the intervals between heartbeat and despair. He believed suffering could be charted like mathematics, each stage revealing a hidden law of nature. What made his methods especially haunting was their invisibility. To outsiders, the Everett children bore no scars. They carried no broken limbs, no blackened eyes. What they carried instead was an emptiness, a quiet so deep it unsettled anyone who tried to speak with them. Neighbors sometimes remarked that the children did not laugh, did not cry, did not even fidget as others their age did. They stood with hands folded, their expressions blank, as though waiting for a command that never came. Jonathan's experiments did not erupt into chaos. They were slow, deliberate, suffocating. Silence stretched across the household like a second skin, binding every member of the family to his will. Even Mary Everett, once the gentle balance to his sternness, had grown pale and withdrawn. Her attempts to comfort the children were met with Jonathan's watchful gaze, a reminder that in his house every gesture was observed, measured, and judged. The method of silence was not simply Jonathan's practice, it was his doctrine. He believed that obedience stripped of sound revealed the purest form of human submission. And in that stillness, he convinced himself, lay the key to mastering life itself. The town saw only a quiet household. They never understood that silence was not peace. It was the sound of a family slowly disappearing into the will of one man. The Everett children were 11 in number, a line of pale faces and bowed heads that seemed to belong more to shadows than to life. In a town where children ran through fields and played by streams, the Everett offspring were rarely seen beyond the iron gates of their estate. When they did appear, they moved with a strange uniformity, walking in silence, their eyes lowered as though the earth itself had been commanded to hold their gaze. To the townsfolk, they were curiosities, perhaps shy or overly disciplined. But inside the house, they were not children at all. They were subjects. Jonathan Everett raised his offspring not as sons and daughters, but as vessels for his unending pursuit of control. He stripped them of individuality, referring to them by numbers in his journals rather than names. He believed that identity clouded observation, and so he attempted to erase it. Meals were eaten in silence, each child seated in rigid formation. Laughter was forbidden. Even crying was considered a failure of discipline, punished with hours of forced isolation. Isolation was Jonathan's favored scalpel. He separated siblings into different rooms for weeks at a time, forbidding contact or even sight of one another. When they were finally reunited, he, studied their reactions closely, noting how long it took before they reached for one another, how long before they broke into tears, how long before they sat together without speaking at all. He seemed fascinated by the way love could erode under pressure, how bonds of family could fray when starved of connection. But his cruelty was not only physical, it was symbolic. Jonathan crafted wooden effigies of his children, carved to their exact sizes, their faces painted white, their eyes black hollows. He seated these lifeless replicas across the dinner table, forcing the children to eat in their presence. Over time, the line between self and effigy began to blur. The children stared at their doubles until their own identities dissolved in the silence. Some even whispered to their wooden twins when Jonathan was not watching, as though seeking comfort in the only reflection allowed to them. Mary Everett, their mother, tried at first to shield them, offering gentle touches and whispered lullabies. But Jonathan's gaze crushed even her tenderness, and she too fell silent. The children learned quickly that affection was dangerous, that closeness drew attention, and that attention meant pain. They folded into themselves, their small bodies moving like shadows in the corridors, learning to survive by becoming invisible. The town remembered them only in fragments. A pale hand clutching the rail of a carriage, a fleeting glimpse of a face in the window. Yet inside they lived in constant scrutiny, every moment recorded in their father's ledger as if they were specimens under glass. Their laughter was buried, their tears silenced, their innocence methodically dismantled. By the winter of 1829, the Everett children no longer resembled the lively sons and daughters the town believed them to be. They were husks, drained of expression, shaped by a father who saw them not as lives entrusted to his care, but as instruments of his obsession. 11 children stood in that house, but to Jonathan they were already coffins waiting to be sealed. Mary Everett had once been the gentler presence within the Everett household, a counterbalance to Jonathan's stern authority. In the earliest years, neighbors remembered her as a woman of soft voice and patient smile, often seen guiding her children by the hand on rare trips to town. Yet over time she seemed to fade, as though each year carved away another piece of her light. By 1829, she was spoken of less as a person and more as a ghost still tethered to the living. The town's record states simply that she took ill. No doctor outside the Everett home was ever summoned. No neighbor invited to witness her decline. One day she was seen at the window, pale but watching, and the next she was gone. Jonathan told the curious that his wife was resting in another room, but days stretched into weeks and no one laid eyes on her again. When asked directly, he replied with a chilling calm that God had chosen to keep her spirit close. No grave was ever dug, no funeral held. It was as though Mary Everett had been erased. Behind the closed doors of the estate, whispers hinted at a far darker truth. Jonathan's journals, unearthed many years later, spoke of Mary not as a partner but as a subject. He described her as the first vessel, noting with cold detachment the changes in her breath, her heartbeat, her resistance. He claimed to have recorded her sobs using a device he was building, something akin to a crude phonograph, designed to capture sound and release it again at will. He called it his echo chamber of grief. The children trapped in that house were forced to endure the haunting of their mother's absence. At night, Jonathan would play back those captured sounds, distorted, broken fragments of Mary's cries and insist the children respond to her voice. They were told to answer her questions, to recite prayers into the darkness as if she were still alive, listening. Their mother's presence had been reduced to a tormenting echo, a disembodied sorrow manipulated at Jonathan's whim. For the children, the confusion was unbearable. They searched the halls for her shadow, listened for her footsteps, prayed she might appear in the doorway, only to be met with Jonathan's device replaying her muffled wails. Over time, they began to believe that their mother had been divided, her soul cut into pieces, fragments locked inside the machine, fragments clutched tightly by Jonathan himself. Neighbors recalled that Mary's absence seemed to drain the life from the Everett home entirely. The windows, once opened to allow her to air the rooms, were now sealed. The garden she had tended wilted and turned wild. Even the servants whispered that without Mary, the children lost their last defense against Jonathan's control. Where she had once shielded them with fleeting kindness, now only his methods remained unopposed, unchallenged. The town, uneasy but silent, did not press further. They accepted Jonathan's vague assurances and turned their eyes away. But inside, the family descended deeper into his grip. Mary Everett's disappearance marked not only the loss of a mother, but the breaking of a final barrier. Without her, the children were entirely his, their world reshaped by silence, their comfort replaced with recordings of grief that played like lullabies from the grave. The coffinless funeral that the town would later stage for the 11 children began here, with the vanishing of their mother. She had been the first to disappear, the first to be erased from both memory and flesh. And though no coffin bore her name, her absence weighed heavier than stone, echoing through every corridor of that house until nothing remained of her but a voice trapped in a machine. As winter deepened, Jonathan Everett's experiments grew more grotesque, his obsessions moving beyond silence and control toward something darker, an attempt to tamper with the very boundary between life and death. He began to speak of what he called the exchange, a ritual that would prove vitality was not fixed but transferable, able to be drained from one body and forced into another. To him, life was not sacred. It was a resource to be shifted, stolen, or repurposed. Neighbors noticed the deliveries first. Carts of livestock arriving at night, sheep and goats led into the Everett barn, their cries muffled against the cold air. By morning, the animals were gone, their bones buried in shallow pits at the edge of the estate. Within the house, Jonathan performed rituals that blended crude science with fevered belief. He bled animals into bowls and forced his children to drink, marking their foreheads with symbols of ash as he chanted phrases no one else could understand. He believed the animal's strength might enter them, its breath mingle with theirs, its endurance flow into their fragile bodies. But his cruelty went further. He constructed crude devices from bellows, tubes, and weights, machines designed to reverse the natural rhythm of breathing. He strapped his children to these contraptions, forcing air into their lungs when their bodies longed to exhale, holding them on the brink of suffocation until their faces turned purple, then releasing them to gasp back a ragged existence. Jonathan recorded the precise moments when consciousness flickered, when panic shifted into surrender, convinced that in those instants life itself was malleable. The survivors of these rituals did not remain unchanged. The children coughed up strange things in the days that followed. Feathers, fragments of wool, even brittle animal teeth, as though their fathers' twisted exchanges had left residue inside them. Jonathan took these as signs of progress, proof that life could intermingle across species, that the barrier between human and beast was thinner than the world believed. His journals describe these outcomes not with horror but with triumph. The rituals blurred the line between faith and science. Jonathan knelt in prayer even as he tightened straps, recited scripture even as he poured blood down his children's throats. He saw no contradiction, only revelation. Where the church preached salvation of the soul, Jonathan preached mastery of the flesh. He believed God had given him permission to unlock secrets others were too timid to face. The children, frail and voiceless, endured these exchanges without resistance. They no longer cried, no longer fought against his demands. Their silence, once enforced, had now become natural, as though their voices had been taken from them. Their bodies carried the marks of their fathers' rituals. Not scars, but the vacant stares of those who no longer recognize the difference between life and death. In Weatherford, whispers began to spread. Neighbors noted the black smoke rising from the chimneys at night, the sickly smell that lingered in the air. Some claimed they heard chanting drifting across the fields, punctuated by cries that did not sound fully human. Yet no one intervened. The Everett name still carried weight, and Jonathan's calm explanations silenced suspicion. What no one realized was that within the walls of that house, the line between experiment and sacrifice had already vanished. The ritual of exchange was not only Jonathan's obsession, it was his declaration. He believed he had found the path to mastery over life itself, and for his family it was the beginning of the end. By the final weeks of winter, the Everett home had become a fortress of silence. The curtains remained drawn, the gates chained, and smoke rose nightly from the chimneys in strange, uneven bursts, carrying a stench that lingered long after dawn. Neighbors no longer knocked at the door, and servants had long since fled. What remained behind those walls was a family slowly being consumed, though the town would not fully understand until it was too late. The children, once seen occasionally in the yard, disappeared entirely from view. Windows that had revealed pale faces now reflected only black cloth stretched across the panes. The laughter of youth, already scarce, was gone altogether. The estate seemed to pulse with secrecy, as though it were no longer a household but a vessel of ritual holding something alive and terrible within. Then in one abrupt moment the Everetts were gone. Not a trace of them was seen by spring. Neighbors realized that days had passed without smoke from the chimneys, without footsteps along the grounds. When the town's elders finally demanded entry, they gathered a small group of men and forced their way through the front door. What they found chilled them into silence. The house was immaculate, too immaculate. Dishes were washed and stacked neatly, beds made with precision, floors scrubbed clean. It was as though the family had been preparing for visitors who never arrived, or had erased themselves from the space they once occupied. The absence of life was more unsettling than any visible violence could have been. In the parlor, arranged in a straight row, stood 11 coffins. Each was nailed shut, each built to the size of a child. Their black surfaces gleamed as though freshly painted, their lids sealed so tightly no one dared attempt to pry them open at first. The weight of them was undeniable. When the men tried to lift one, they struggled, though no one could say what pressed so heavily within. Eventually, curiosity overcame dread, and one coffin was forced open. Inside, there was no body, only sand, stones, and a carefully folded piece of clothing, a child's garment pressed flat as though meant to resemble its absent owner. The other coffins were the same. Not one contained a body, and yet each carried a symbolic weight, as though the missing children had been reduced to tokens, their existence traded for silence. The townsmen searched the house in desperation. They tore through the cellar, the attic, the outbuildings, but found no trace of Jonathan Everett, his wife, or any of the 11 children. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no hurried escape. The family had vanished as though swallowed whole. All that remained were those empty coffins lined up like accusations against the living. The air inside the house seemed wrong. One man later swore he heard whispers coming from the cellar, though no one else admitted to it. Another claimed the coffins themselves shifted when left unattended, as if something inside had tried to move. Fear gripped the searchers, and they decided to leave the house intact, carrying only the coffins with them. When they emerged, the town gathered in uneasy silence. No explanation was given, no truth offered. 11 coffins had been found, but no bodies. Jonathan Everett, once a physician and patriarch, was nowhere to be seen. His children were gone, his wife forgotten, his home stripped of life. That night, as the coffins lay in the church, guarded but unopened, Weatherford understood something it could not put into words. The Everett family had not merely disappeared. They had been consumed by something the town had no language for, something that could not be exorcised with prayer or buried with ritual. The vanishing of the 11 was not an end. It was the beginning of a haunting that would never leave Weatherford soil. The discovery of the 11 coffins left the town of Weatherford paralyzed. The elders, desperate to contain panic, decided that a burial must take place, even if the coffins held no flesh. They reasoned that closure was necessary, that ritual might smother the rising tide of dread. And so, on a cold morning heavy with fog, the townsfolk gathered in the cemetery to watch what none of them could comprehend. The burial of 11 children without a single body to mourn. The coffins were carried one by one, their weight unnatural, their contents still a mystery to those outside the small circle who had dared open them. The priest stood at the center of the graves, his voice trembling as he began the rites. Yet he faltered. His words seemed hollow when spoken over boxes filled with sand and stones. At last he muttered only fragments of scripture, unwilling to call the ritual complete. It was a funeral without death, a performance of grief without the comfort of truth. Families wept as the coffins were lowered, their sobs echoing across the cemetery. Yet beneath the grief was unease, a gnawing suspicion that what they mourned was not death but disappearance. Children clung to their mothers, whispering of sounds they swore they had heard. One claimed the lids rattled, another that scratching rose faintly from the earth once the first layers of soil fell. Their voices were hushed, but the fear spread quietly among the adults. As dusk approached, a strange heaviness settled over the cemetery. The gravediggers noticed it first. When they tried to lift the Last coffin, they struggled as though its weight had grown since morning. They muttered that the others had felt heavier too, though no one dared to speak it aloud. Some swore the earth resisted, as if the coffins themselves did not wish to be buried. Still they pressed on, shoveling soil over wood until only dark mounds remained. That night the town did not sleep. Windows were shuttered, lamps kept burning long after midnight. Whispers spread that the coffins had not been empty at all, that Jonathan Everett had filled them with something unseen, something that grew heavier with every passing hour. A few swore that they heard faint cries drifting from the cemetery, though when they ventured close they found only silence, the graves marked and undisturbed. The burial, meant to bring peace, instead deepened the unease. Weatherford had sealed its fear into the ground, but the ground did not hide it. Each of the 11 graves stood as a reminder not of life lost, but of a truth withheld. The townsfolk had chosen ritual over answers, silence over confrontation. And in doing so, they had buried more than empty coffins. They had buried their own willingness to look at the evil that had lived among them. The cemetery grew quiet as the fog thickened, but in every home, hearts beat faster, haunted by the weight of what had been lowered into the soil. The Everett children were gone, but their absence was not empty. It was heavy, heavier than stone, pressing down on the town with a burden that would never lift. When the coffins were sealed into the soil, Weatherford breathed only the shallowest sigh of relief. The ritual was complete, but the truth was not buried. The Everett estate still stood on the edge of town, its windows blackened, its gates rusting in the cold wind. With the family gone and their names lowered into empty graves, the house became something more than a home. It became a wound, a monument to everything unspoken. At first, townsfolk avoided it. Children were warned not to wander near the estate, and even adults crossed the street when walking past. But curiosity gnawed at them, as it always does when fear is sharpened by silence. Some men, emboldened by drink or dared by friends, trespassed beyond the gates. What they found inside was not a house abandoned in haste, but a house preserved with unsettling order. Chairs remained pushed neatly to the table, though no meal had been eaten in months. Beds were made with stiff precision, pillows fluffed as if awaiting occupants who would never return. The hearth was swept clean, the shelves dusted. It was as if the family had stepped into another room, intending to return at any moment, and yet their absence hung over every detail. The emptiness was not natural, it was deliberate, curated like a museum of lives that had been erased. And then there were the sounds. Trespassers spoke of faint drips echoing through the halls, though no water ran and no leak could be found. Others swore they heard muffled cries rising through the vents, or laughter that darted from room to room before fading into silence. One man claimed he heard a woman's voice singing softly in the parlor, only to find the room empty but for a phonograph-like device on the mantel, its horn twisted, its crank slowly unwinding on its own. In the cellar, the evidence of Jonathan Everett's obsessions lay in plain sight. Iron hooks lined the walls, rust clinging to their edges. Chains bolted into stone suggested restraint, though no bodies remained to tell the story. Jars sat on shelves filled with fluids, both clear and murky, each labeled in Jonathan's precise hand: time, grief, obedience. Some jars contained no liquid at all, only air sealed tight, as if something invisible had been captured and preserved. A few even carried fragments of hair, teeth, or fingernails floating in amber light. The cellar was colder than the earth itself, a place where breath came in mist even during the warmer months. Those who lingered too long described a pressure in their ears, as though the house itself were listening. One visitor claimed the walls seemed to pulse faintly, like veins carrying blood. Another said he heard the sound of footsteps pacing directly above, though the floors had long been empty. Objects within the house refused to remain still. A chair dragged slightly out from the table would be pushed back by morning. Windows nailed shut would rattle against their frames, though no wind stirred outside. Lamps left extinguished would be found lit hours later, their oil untouched. The estate seemed to follow a hidden order, as if Jonathan's rituals had not ended with his disappearance but continued without him, replaying themselves in endless repetition. The longer the house stood empty, the more it became a presence in the town's imagination. Mothers used it as a warning to children who misbehaved. Young men dared each other to enter after dark, though few stayed more than minutes. Visitors from neighboring villages came to see the infamous Everett estate, only to leave unsettled, whispering of the air that seemed too heavy, the walls that seemed to hum faintly when touched. Over time, the house ceased to be called a home at all. It became a place of legend, an unspoken scar. Town records noted its structure but never its soul. Those who entered swore they felt watched, and those who listened swore the house still carried the sounds of the family it had consumed. It stood not as a ruin, but as a monument, a building stripped of its inhabitants, yet more alive in their absence than it had ever been when they were present. For the people of Weatherford, the Everett estate was no longer just a house. It was a reminder, an accusation, and a warning. It stood waiting at the edge of town, patient as stone, carrying within its walls the echo of a man's hunger for control. The coffins had been buried, but the house remained, and as long as it remained, so too did the dread that what had begun within its walls was not truly finished. Decades after the Everetts vanished, when the estate had begun to rot and ivy curled across its walls, workmen clearing the property stumbled upon a hidden compartment built into the floorboards of the study. Inside were bundles of journals, their leather covers cracked with age, their pages filled with the careful, unwavering handwriting of Jonathan Everett. These writings became the closest thing to a confession the town would ever receive. The journals were not frantic or deranged, as one might expect from a man accused by legend of unspeakable acts. Instead, they were calm, deliberate, almost elegant in their precision. Jonathan described his methods not with horror but with pride, each entry cataloging what he called exchanges. He spoke of draining one life to extend another, of calculating the precise moment when a soul might loosen its grip upon the body, of holding a child on the edge of suffocation to capture what he termed the breath before surrender. The words were chilling not for their madness but for their clarity. He never once called his actions torture or cruelty. To him they were experiments, necessary steps toward revelation. He wrote of his children as vessels tested, their names absent, replaced with numbers and symbols. Mary Everett appeared only briefly, referred to as the prototype failed. In one passage he claimed her voice had been preserved successfully, proof that memory and spirit could be trapped even after the body was gone. The journals revealed not only what Jonathan had done, but how he saw himself. He believed he was not a destroyer but a craftsman, unlocking hidden laws of existence. He compared himself to natural philosophers, to alchemists of centuries past. Where others feared the silence of death, he claimed to have measured it, charted it, and bent it to his will. He saw no sin in this, only progress. One entry in particular stood apart. Written in a steady hand, it declared, "The world is not ready for me, but it will be." Silence is survival. Beneath the words was a symbol, a circle divided by a single vertical line, repeated throughout the journals like a private seal. Some believed it represented a vessel split open, others that it marked the line between life and death. Whatever its meaning, it was the last mark Jonathan Everett left behind. The discovery of the journals reignited fear in Weatherford. The coffins buried decades earlier had become local legend, but here was proof that the rumors were not mere stories. The words confirmed what many had whispered, that the Everett children had been consumed not by accident or illness, but by their father's obsession. The house was condemned soon after, but the journals were preserved, locked in archives where even scholars hesitated to read them in full. Jonathan Everett's voice, captured in ink, outlived every member of his family. The bodies were gone, the graves empty, the estate abandoned, but the journals endured. They offered no apology, no remorse, only a cold insistence that silence and control were the keys to survival. For Weatherford, they were not merely writings. They were indictments. Each page was another coffin heavy with absence, carrying a truth that could never again be buried. Time did not erase the Everetts from Weatherford's memory. If anything, the years only deepened the wound. The 11 graves, marked with simple stones, became landmarks of unease. People avoided walking near them at night, yet children dared each other to touch the markers, whispering that to linger too long would invite a hand to reach up from the soil and pull them under. The coffins may have been empty, but their presence was heavy, as if the earth itself remembered what had been hidden from it. Visitors began to come from neighboring towns, drawn by the story of coffins buried without bodies. Some sought proof of the supernatural, others merely curious of tragedy. They stood in silence before the graves, imagining the vanished family, and left unsettled, whispering that the air seemed heavier within that patch of ground than anywhere else in Weatherford. The coffins had become symbols not of closure but of absence, monuments to a family erased without explanation. The scandal of the Everett disappearance sparked changes in law. Massachusetts, still struggling in its early decades of statehood, implemented stricter requirements for burial. No coffin would again be lowered without proper examination, identification, and proof of death. The Everett coffins had been filled with sand and clothing, lowered in haste to appease a grieving town. Legislators feared such desecration of ritual could spread panic if repeated. In this way, the Everetts left behind not only legend but policy, rules meant to prevent the burial of lies. Yet the legacy was not only legal, it was personal, emotional, corrosive. Families who had once been close to the Everetts lived with quiet shame for not intervening. Neighbors who had ignored the black smoke, the strange cries, the whispered suspicions now carried the weight of silence. They told themselves they could not have known, Yet in secret they admitted that they had seen enough to suspect. What haunted them most was not Jonathan Everett's cruelty, but their own failure to confront it. Some claimed that the Everetts did not die at all. Rumors spread of pale figures wandering in distant towns, children who looked too old and too young at once, a gaunt man who spoke softly and measured the breathing of those he passed. Whether these were sightings of survivors or inventions of guilty minds, they kept the legend alive. The Everetts had become less a family than a myth, their absence feeding endless speculation. The estate itself was eventually abandoned, its walls collapsing under ivy and rot, but the house never lost its reputation. Trespassers continued to report strange happenings, footsteps pacing the halls, objects shifting when left alone, and the faint sound of a woman's cry echoing from the parlor. Some insisted the coffins buried in the cemetery were not truly empty, that Jonathan had found a way to fill them with something unseen, something that lingered beneath the soil and grew heavier with time. For the people of Weatherford, the legacy of the Everett family was not one of death, but of silence. Their disappearance had been met with denial, their coffins filled with symbols instead of flesh, their truth buried to spare the living from shame. But silence cannot erase horror. It only preserves it, like a voice caught in a machine or a secret sealed in a journal. The coffins remain to this day markers of a story unfinished. They are visited not to mourn the dead, but to confront the weight of what was never acknowledged. In their stillness, they accuse every passerby, not of murder, but of complicity. The Everetts were gone, but what they left behind was a silence so deep that even generations later it could still be heard. The Everett story did not end with the burials nor with the rotting of their estate. It lingered in the marrow of Weatherford, whispered through generations as both warning and confession. For the true horror of the Everett family was never just the 11 empty coffins, nor even the vanished bodies. It was the silence that allowed it all to happen. Evil does not always arrive in fire or with blood on its hands. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as respectability, cloaked in discipline, carried by a man who shook hands with neighbors and spoke softly of Scripture. Jonathan Everett embodied that form of evil. His cruelty was not chaotic but measured, his experiments conducted with patience, his household maintained with the outward face of order. He did not terrify his town by shouting, but by never giving them reason to look too closely. His power was his silence, and the silence of those around him. The coffins buried without bodies became the perfect metaphor for what had happened in Weatherford. They were hollow shells filled with stone and sand, lowered into the ground as if weight alone could substitute for truth. The town wanted closure but not confrontation, ritual but not reality. They chose the comfort of ceremony over the agony of discovery, and in doing so they buried their complicity alongside the Everett's absence. The coffins became symbols of what happens when a community buries its own unease. To outsiders, the Everett case was a curiosity, a strange tale from a small town. But to those who lived in Weatherford, it was a scar. Families spoke less openly about the Everetts with each passing decade, as though silence could erase the memory. And yet silence was precisely what had enabled Jonathan Everett in the first place. His household had been a fortress, but it was also an open secret. Neighbors had smelled the strange fumes, heard the cries, noticed the absence of children from the yard. They had looked away, telling themselves it was not their place, that Jonathan was a man of learning, of faith beyond suspicion. In their silence, his cruelty thrived. What makes the Everett story most haunting is its ordinariness. Jonathan did not storm into Weatherford as an invader. He was one of them, respected, trusted. His house was not a battlefield. It was a home, outwardly no different from theirs. And yet behind its closed doors, horrors unfolded that would scar the town forever. The evil was not supernatural. It was human, precise, relentless, and allowed to continue because it did not announce itself. The legacy of the Everett Coffins is not only a story of one family's destruction. It is a reflection of how evil operates when no one dares to speak. It shows how silence, chosen out of fear, pride, or convenience, can become the very soil in which cruelty grows. It was not only Jonathan Everett who destroyed his family, it was the silence of Weatherford that gave him the space to do it. Even now, when visitors walk among the 11 graves, they remark on the weight of the air, the way sound seems to fall still. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is the echo of silence itself. The same silence that killed a family and left behind coffins without bodies. In that hush lies the reminder that evil does not always roar. More often it whispers and waits behind respectable doors until generations are broken. The story of the Everett family closes not with answers but with questions that linger heavier than the coffins themselves. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since those 11 boxes were lowered into the soil, filled not with bodies but with symbols of absence. And still, their weight presses on the imagination. For in truth, the Everetts are less a story of one man's cruelty than of how such cruelty is allowed to live unseen. Could it happen again? That is the question that haunts Weatherford's descendants. The natural instinct is to believe such horrors are relics of the past, belonging to a century when medicine was crude and belief mingled freely with superstition. Yet history insists otherwise. Behind school doors, within churches, inside homes that appear respectable from the street, silence still provides cover for cruelty. It is never announced with fire. It creeps forward quietly, wearing the mask of authority, patience, and order. Jonathan Everett was not a monster from folklore. He was a father, a physician, a man who spoke calmly and acted with discipline. That is what makes him terrifying even now. His evil was not obvious, it was methodical. His rituals did not erupt in chaos but unfolded in silence, behind doors no one dared to open. He did not frighten the town into complicity. He lulled it into stillness, into the belief that nothing was wrong so long as nothing was spoken. And that is why his story matters still. Every society buries its coffins, not always with wood and nails, but with silence, excuses, and denial. Families hide shame to preserve appearances. Institutions bury scandals to protect reputations. Communities look the other way because the truth would demand action, and action is dangerous. Weatherford was not unique. The Everett coffins are reminders of what happens when symbols are buried in place of reality. When people allow themselves to mourn without ever demanding truth, the graves remain in Weatherford, simple markers weathered by time, visited by the curious, the fearful, and the grieving. Some leave flowers, others leave notes asking questions no one has ever answered. What became of the Everett children? Where did Jonathan go? Did the ritual succeed in ways too dreadful to name? The silence offers no reply. It is in that silence that the story finds its true voice. For the Everetts, the legacy was not only their disappearance, it was the lesson that evil thrives in the spaces we refuse to see. When we hush children who whisper of strange sounds, when we accept half-truths because they are easier than confrontation, when we allow respectability to shield cruelty, we are digging graves of our own, graves that may never hold bodies but will always hold guilt. And so the final question is left to us, the living. Would we notice if it were happening again? Could a family disappear behind closed doors today while neighbors chose not to interfere? Could silence still be mistaken for peace even as it smothers the voices within? The Everett story insists that the answer is yes unless we dare to confront what hides in the quiet. The 11 coffins rest still in Massachusetts soil, heavy with stones, heavier with silence. They accuse not only the man who placed them there, but the community that allowed him to rule his house unchecked. And they accuse us too, reminding us that silence is never empty. It is complicit, it is enduring, and it is dangerous. The Everett coffins are more than a local legend. They are a warning, a reminder that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it prays, sometimes it smiles. And if we do not listen closely, if we do not dare to speak, we may one day find ourselves standing again at the edge of graves, filled not with truth, but with the weight of what we refuse to face. So I ask you, what do you think? Could this happen again? Would we notice? Or would we, like Weatherford, choose silence and walk away as the earth is smoothed over 11 coffins that hold nothing but our unanswered questions?